Before I introduce myself, I just want to ask a question. Raise your hand if you have children. Now lower your hand if you have children but you're not married. Okay, so if this audience were Gen Alpha and Gen Z, half of the people who had children wouldn't be married. I think that's quite an astonishing change in norms that have governed all of our lives. And I want to touch on it a little bit later. But first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Anant, and I run a consultancy called Matter of Form. We do three things. We do brand strategy, digital experience, and innovation, and we do it for timeless brands. For us, a timeless brand is three things. It is an organization that thinks long-term. It's a business that is founded on a strong spirit, that has strong ethos, and it's an organization who see design as a point of competitive advantage. I think that's probably true of every brand at this conference. We do it for organizations in jewelry, watches, hospitality, other craft-driven businesses like Zaha Hadid, all sorts, a mixture. So today, one of the first themes that I want to talk about is value. And I want to start by talking about a documentary on Netflix that I watched the other day, and it's called Sour Grapes. Has anyone seen this documentary? No one's seen it. Maybe it's a London thing, but it is a fascinating documentary about an Indonesian man who cons hundreds of wine aficionados in California out of tens of millions of dollars. Right? He mixes fake wines, and he tells a great story, and all of these people buy his wines, and they're none the wiser. Right? And the stories he tells create this sort of sense of value, this reinforced sense of value that actually backs up this authentic pleasure. Right? These people who drink his wine, fake wines, some of these wines, hundreds of thousands, they love it. They really genuinely love this wine. But the most fascinating part of this documentary is that when he's uncovered as being a fraud, right, none of the people who've bought the wine believe that he's a fraud, right? They're so invested, and they've got such a high sunk cost bias. No, this is not fake wine, this is genuine. Right? And you know, for me, it just illustrates the power of story and the power of story in providing context to all sorts of unquantifiable forms of value that exist in the world in which we live in today. I mean, how astonishing must it have been for those in the world of art to have seen soup cans that were worth so much money, but didn't really seem to be a demonstration of the inherent craft that people were used to in art. And perhaps more recently, as astonishing as this, frankly, slightly dejected-looking ape after the NFT crash of the last year. But you know, it's ultimately something that has been backed up by people who have gravitas, and those people who have gravitas provide story that gives context, that drives status, that makes value. In a world where if you have money, you can have anything, it's stories that have increasingly become a form of social capital. I think there's like an old saying, no man or woman is poorer than that who only has money. So why am I talking about stories in the context of innovation? I'm talking about stories because I think it's incredibly important to be reminded of some of the human truths that govern what creates value in the world in which we live in. Right? The formats might change. There might be Web3, there might be NFTs, there might be immersive experiences, left, right, and center. But some of the truths about how we tell our brand story, they don't change. Right? Stories create meaning and value, and they always have done. Right? In the medieval ages, a handful of nutmeg could buy you a ship. Why could it buy you a ship? Because those who held dinner parties used it as a conduit into telling stories of exotic cultures that heightened their sense of status. And in fact, several years afterwards, you could buy an entire estate with a handful of cloves. I find this stuff so astonishing, how value has shifted over the ages. And we all know that it's exactly what De Beers did in 1938. Right? They controlled the supply of diamonds. Engagement rings weren't really a thing. They, through advertising, created desire in a category that didn't already exist before. And what's valuable, right, is changing, and we're really in a moment where that change is significant, more significant than it's been for the last couple of decades. So I will touch on value again as I move through the presentation, but because this is the first presentation of the day, I just want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the industry more broadly. It's a big industry. Luxury has been recession-proof. Watches and jewelry in particular has done very well over the last few years. By 2030, this is predicted to be $520 billion. It's an 8.5% growth year on year from the $200 billion that it's worth today. In fact, Sotheby's reported on an online auction in March last year a 97% sell-through rate. Right. What I find really fascinating is that 20% of all bidders across 32 countries were new to Sotheby's. How people engage online, the things they're willing to invest in online, the big ticket items they're prepared to spend money on online has completely changed over the last few years, and wealth is being generated in new countries in new ways. The premium demanded for some of these items has only increased. I think it was $57.5 million the De Beers Blue, I think, sold last year. But then at the other end of the spectrum, we also have this emerging middle class, lower entry points. To go back to this advert, half of Gen Z women believe an engagement ring should cost between $100 and $999. That's a far cry from the 2 months of salary that De Beers suggested back in 1938 signified true love. The Chinese customer is back and in person and will be 50% of all luxury shopping. And big moves are happening in the industry. Right? LVMH buying organizations like Pedemonte, who combine technology and craft and back up their supply chain. Companies who didn't even exist in the category, moving into the category with genderless fine jewelry collections based on pavé traceable diamonds and recycled gold. Large players in the category moving into completely dematerial worlds, right? NFTIF, Beyond Wonder. But despite that, and that construct of value that is beginning to exist dematerially, right, there's also an intrinsic value that's increasing. I find this particularly interesting, like Amrapali. Right, they saw a 300% increase in customers who came to their stores in London just to buy loose gems. Right, they didn't want the customization or the things that sat around the core gem. They came just to buy loose gems. They saw it as a good investment. And that's resulting in platforms like IceCap, right, where people are trading what they consider to be a safe commodity. So basically, in summary, every aspect of this industry is increasing, whether it's the aspect that's in the business of perceived value or whether it's the aspect of the industry that's sort of, in the business of what you might consider to be intrinsic value. Just to drop a little bit of a bombshell about the customer, I found this quite interesting. 2 years ago, women surpassed men as the lead purchasers of flowers. Right? And it's a slightly facetious headline in prelude to what I found very interesting as is relevant to this category. Right? A decade ago, right, just 5% of women bought themselves jewelry. Right? Last year, 40% of jewelry was bought by women for themselves. It's quite a dramatic change in 10 years. I actually can't believe how little it was in 2012. It's not even that long ago. 5%, it's nothing. the same is happening for men as well. Right? When Liberty moved some of their fine jewelry collections from the women's floor to the men's floor, they saw a 72% increase in sales. That's huge. Right? And perhaps underpinning all of this is this gender fluid movement, right? When it comes to advertising jewelry, when it comes to advertising watches. Comme des Garçons leveraged their sort of androgynous positioning to partner with Mikimoto to launch a highly successful line of jewelry based on this premise. And you can see, products like LVMH Vault, they're increasingly modeled equally. It's a really, really big step change. To my point at the beginning of this presentation, rituals that we perhaps once all took for granted, engagement, weddings, these norms that have been part of, of how we're used to sort of gifting and how we're used to celebrating relationships are changing. We're seeing brands like LA's Ceremony capitalize on that, right? It's actually a great thing. People want to celebrate different types of moments, and that's an amazing marketing opportunity, right? To redefine the types of things that various tribes might consider special, and to turn those into things that are linked to your product. And at the top end of the market, you can see companies like De Beers investing almost 100 million in Lightbox. And while they're lab-grown diamonds, and that is a core part of the reason for their investment, they also have moved away from De Beers' traditional marketing slogans centered around traditional forms of love and relationship. People are just really free today to be different people in different moments, right? The luxury customer is really flexible. And that is a huge opportunity when you are in the business of selling things that have perceived value and are linked to story, and you have the opportunity to enact a part of that story and create like a valuable exchange. Tech and symbolism, they're vying for a space on our wrist, right? We have Apple watches and Ringly and Oro devices that vie for the same space that watches and jewelry once vied for. But again, because the customer's more flexible, there are more opportunities to design beautiful moments. What they wear one day won't be the same as what they wear the next. In fact, the technology that we wear is so commoditized and looks so generic that there's a space to enhance things that have become commonplace on everyone's body. Companies like Boucheron are also using technology to explore entirely new materials, right? Materials that, again, don't have any intrinsic value. That value will only be propped up by story. I find really interesting what Raythel and Wolf are doing, which is actually open sourcing design. So when you purchase something, you purchase a metaversal artifact, but you also purchase the rights to 3D print that product in whatever materials you choose to print it in. Tomorrow's customer will also exist in new realms. Right? Gaming is going to grow to become the world's largest media category. I'm not a gamer, personally. And I think if you're not a gamer, it's really hard to get your head around the fact that places of influence won't just be music, TV, film, like you're used to if you're not in the world of gaming. If you're to believe this chart, it's actually already bigger than all of the other media categories combined. Right? And it's super evenly spread amongst income, amongst age. And what's not represented on this chart is it's also very, very split evenly between gender. Male and female have similar proportions of gamers, which I also found quite astonishing because I've always associated gaming as very much a male thing, a male in a basement thing. And that digital physical augmentation is a really interesting opportunity for brands to leverage, right? Louis Vuitton's partnership with League of Legends allows you to unlock further customization for pieces of jewelry, and in fact, even access to the physical products based on player competency. Right? So your strategy for the metaverse or for Web3 needs to consider your future customers as a player, not just as a customer. It's a mindset shift. Now, it's sort of impossible when setting a scene to open a conference to maybe not talk about NFTs. And if Paris Hilton's excited about NFTs, then surely you should be too. But we've all seen, in fact, that there's been so much success in the world of NFTs. Success, I say in inverted commas, that some of those NFTs have made their way into physical products. Right, by 2030, $300 billion will be spent on NFTs. Right, that's 10% of the whole luxury market. My advice always with NFTs in the world of Web3 is to tread carefully. It's very, very easy to capitalize on brand equity and create very high margin products that use your brand to create value. It's very easy to lose that value very quickly if your foray into that world is done without taste and is done incorrectly. I don't know, there's a marketing professor called Rory Sutherland, and he mentioned something that always stayed with me, which was, in this material world in which we live in, if we can create value from things that are completely dematerial, then surely that's the apex of environmentalism. But when considering a Web3 strategy, or when considering NFTs, we need to move from a mindset that's focused on reinterpreting, the analog products that we have around us, to really reimagining what products look like when influenced by science fiction, when influenced by gaming. Right? Bayer Chronometry did a hugely successful NFT Web3 drop. However, what do you actually own when you buy an NFT? At the moment, there are serious problems with interoperability. And so when you buy these watches, you're not buying anything that can tell the time, nor are you buying anything that can move from one space to another. So the market is yet to mature. Irrespective of that, we're seeing all sorts of platforms emerge that allow you to link physical and digital products, right? So in fashion, there are platforms like the Dematerialized. Right? In jewelry, there's things like HW3, where you can store and archive digital collectibles. I actually really like this example from the world of drinks. A company called Block Bar, right, I think really nicely demonstrates the interplay between physical product and virtual product, right? When you buy fine wines or spirits, you buy them in bond, and they're stored as NFTs in your phone, so you have bragging rights, you can talk about them, you can show them to people. It offers the brand the opportunity to open up further context and story. And when you decide to drink that fine wine or spirit, your NFT combusts, and you're sent the spirit to enjoy. The big auction houses have moved to Web3. There are so many advantages offered through things like smart contracts that can help track provenance, ownership, repairs, all sorts of advantageous aspects that can be sort of brought to the buying process and to the process long after an individual purchases something, to unlocking the story that adds meaning and value to the thing that's being bought. Elsewhere in the world of luxury, we're lightening up, right? Like, can you imagine 10 years ago Tiffany partnering with Nike? Or Gucci partnering with North Face? Yeah. Or Francois Bourgeois, that TikTok influencer, partnering with the Orient Express? We're lightening up. We're finding unexpected ways to collaborate with those who represent niche culture, and we're doubling down on it. It's super interesting, and it's reflective of the fact the customer is flexible. But the power is also shifting to the customer. Right? These Paris sneakers that were launched last year really divided the room. Right? Are they a commentary on poverty? Are they a mockery of the social class system? Are they a mockery of those who can't afford to feed and clothe themselves? As a brand, your tonal qualities and the things that you choose to stand by have become unbelievably important. You run the risk of being cancelled if there are inconsistencies. Not if you say the wrong thing, if you don't stick to the thing that you said you were about, right? So in luxury in general, there's this shift from product-driven innovation, right? This very analog world that's predictable, that's quite infrequent, a world of press releases that exists in its own world, that waits to be found, that's quite mystical and standoffish, on its own terms and purist, to one that's about values-driven innovation, right? To one that's a democracy. Huge amounts of transparency in supply chain. You can buy anything you see anyone else has. Frequently engaging and surprising, and companies now engaging in rich, confident, bold, integrated campaigns that seek to explore new worlds and come and find their customer in niche pockets that exist across all sorts of domains. Very much on the customer's terms, and brands, the expectation is that they're brave, experimental, and collaborative. So I now talk quickly about the experience, right? Every aspect of the funnel is changing when purchasing high-end products. And the story really begins with the showroom, right? Jewelry and watches famously is a category where you don't necessarily encourage customers to come and touch and feel the product. Right? It's a bit like, okay, you don't do that. But unfolding that story and beginning to create associations that build the paradigm of value start at the first touch point, and how you think about stores or trade stands or other physical components of your brand experience has changed. Right? You need to really rethink that precious time you have physically with someone in a world that's become digital. We see companies like Swarovski redesigning all of their stores, or previously the Tiffany exhibition, doubling down on that thought. Because the other end of the funnel, right, people are basically expecting to have their gems sent to them so they can preview things at home before even buying. I mean, this isn't even framed as a return. This is just a preview, that Frank Darling offer prospective customers. The truth is that clienteling and a one-to-one service online has been made far more prosaic after COVID, right? EIP Privé, 3% of their customers drive 40% of all of their sales, right? Just by having like a one-to-one relationship with their customers, despite digital. Thread styling, they're doing 1 million plus transactions just on WhatsApp. COVID's really pragmatized how we engage with our customers. That's a big opportunity. Now, a couple of other things that I think are relevant to this sector that perhaps aren't as prevalent as they are in other sectors. People, even when they have the money, are moving from the desire to own things to a desire to subscribe. Right? They want flexibility. They want to be able to select different things. They want to be able to update their look. We can see it in high-end fashion, things like Rent the Runway. We can see all of the car brands switching to subscription models with Uber-esque counterpart apps. We can see it in private aviation. So I just want to summarize a couple of key thoughts. The first is that value is really driven by story, right? And story starts way before a prospective customer even comes in contact with the product. But it also continues into their relationship with the product long after they've bought it. The second point is that the market is growing, right? Both the intrinsic worth of jewelry and watches, as well as the design aspect, right? They're both independent areas for value creation. The third is really important, and it's the refining of your tonal quality. How do you speak to your customers, right? Customers are hypersensitive. They want confidence, right? But they want consistency. That consistency, there's so much noise in this world that our armor that we've all developed is picking up on inconsistency, right? The minute we pick up on inconsistency, we lose trust. That's one of the big dangers linked, in my mind, to moving too quickly into areas like Web3 and undermining the craft, provenance, and trust that should be implicit within your brand. The fourth is around gaming. It's a key part of the future. Just like music and film, it'll be a key channel in luxury more broadly, right? But gaming requires a player strategy, not a customer strategy. It's different. The fifth is things like smart contracts can really open up stories on provenance, right? They can protect resale, and they represent a really interesting commercial opportunity, especially with things like resale, but it's a separate story. And the sixth is, business models are changing, right? Shared ownership, experience showrooms, friction-free digital clienteling, try at home. These things all put pressure on business models. So you need to pick the things that are relevant to the type of organization that you are. Okay, so questions that I think are important to ask is like, what's your brand script? How do you enact the story to the customer? Where will you create value? Right, intrinsic or design. Intrinsic is related to the sort of quality of the product or design. What are your quirks and key beliefs? How are you going to stand out from the sea of sameness? What is your challenge and action? Can Web3 be useful to actually protect your business model and open up stories that create meaning and value? And where do you add and remove friction, right? And I'll come to the point around friction in a second. But first, I just want to sort of drill down from like the macro points made at the beginning of this presentation to just a reminder of a couple of human truths that I find really interesting. Expectation theory, right? Expectations impact experience. In a test, 2 of the same chocolate cakes, one titled velvet chocolate cake, the other titled chocolate cake, 10% increase objectively in like taste profile, right? Everyone who ate the velvet chocolate cake rated it 10% better than those who just ate the chocolate cake. Right? It's like, the things that we expect to happen impact our what I would call objective appreciation, right, of the product or experience, right? Marketing isn't just selling something to someone, it's beginning to start creating the associations that impact the experience. To my point at the beginning of this presentation about Rudy, the wine fraudster, stories impact experience, expectation theory. The second point I wanted to make relates to the other end of the funnel. Right? If you aren't confidently putting content and story between your customer and commerce, right, you run the risk of this phenomena called buyer's remorse. Buyer's remorse is basically like a come down. If you buy a product and you haven't engaged with the story that sits behind it, right? People basically feel dejected. They buy something, but they haven't gone on a journey to buy it, and they won't be loyal customers or advocates for your product in the future. So conversion isn't the apex. It's not where we're trying to get to. We're trying to get beyond conversion. We're trying to create an experience that creates lifelong fans, not one-off purchases. Okay, this is a bit of a weird example, right? I've purposely chosen an example that's in a completely different sector, but I found it interesting, and it's about anchoring value, right? This is an example, like, as you can tell, from like the beginning of the internet, right? When The Economist wanted to sell subscriptions, online subscriptions and print subscriptions. They had 2 choices. One of the choices was theeconomist.com for $60. The other choice was theeconomist.com and the print subscription for $125. I mean, these guys were dismayed because like 98% of people chose the online-only subscription, despite the fact the internet looked like that at the time. They then introduced a decoy option, right? Which was just the print subscription for $125. So now you have the .com subscription for $60, and you've got the print for $125, and then you've got the online and print also for $125, right? 96% of people then chose the print and online because it was great value. Now, I've chosen this like example that's sort of diametrically opposite example from watches and jewelry, but it is as relevant, right? Everyone is looking for value. Like, it doesn't matter how much money they're spending. In fact, normally, ultra high net worth individuals, they're the one who love like getting value the most. We all know this. So anchor, create options, frame how you sell your products in a way that gives people a point of relative reference, right? So they understand what they're spending the money on, where the premium is. Okay. A bit of a provocation. It's like, what would your brand mean if there was no product? Right? It's like, what's that like inherent value? What is your business when you remove the inherent value? And the reason I talk about this is because, for me, one of the key aspects of what the future holds for this industry is ritual and the level of invested effort that you can draw your prospective customer into, right? Because we live in a world where if you've got money, anyone can have anything, right? And it's back to that like the point about sunk cost bias with Rudy and his wine fraud, it's true of, well, we'll do some examples in a moment. The thing is, in life, if things are too easy, right, if there's no arc, if there's no tension, right, then there is no story. Right? We are hardwired to engage with stories that follow the hero's journey. Right? The hero's journey is like, individual, has call to adventure, goes through various trials and failures, has a bit of a revelation, changes internally, but sort of returns physically back to the village he started from, or he or she started from. The point is, they go through a level of personal change or personal investment of their time to then buy in to the product or to the story, gives the story meaning, gives the product value. It's what's made companies like Le Labo so successful, right? You invest your effort and time into seeing these things mixed. You see the ritual of them. In a completely different industry, it's what's made SoulCycle so successful, the cult of SoulCycle time. Okay, and similarly, it's it's what's made companies like Vashi so successful, right? You're really part of the design process. So I'll be quick. Innovation is the lifeblood of the strongest luxury brands, but being timeless used to be very easy. It was about heritage, it was about quality, it was about craft. But the customer in the category, they've changed, right? We've got these young luxury customers. We've got preferences that are shaped younger. We've got competition for attention. Okay, this is funny, right? There was an experiment that was conducted, with men and women, and they had their phones taken away for 15 minutes, and they were told you can have an electric shock or have your phone back, And I'm embarrassed of my half of the species to say 64% of men took the electric shock to have their phone back, only 20% of women. The point is, our attention spans and our ability to just sit quietly with ourselves has been hugely disrupted. We've just a complete rewiring of our brains. Sorry, I know I'm a bit low on time. So we're also very reliant on technology, right? So timelessness, it requires constant innovation. We've got to think about new customers. We've got to tap into new attitudes. We've got to do the unexpected and experimental, push things forwards while harnessing the power of tech and doing it in a way that's tasteful. It doesn't undermine our brand values. I mean, it's not an easy feat as a brand. I think the problem with innovation at the moment is there are like two types of innovation. There's this really small innovation that's incremental and it doesn't really move things forward and it's a bit sort of internal and back officey. And then there's big innovation, which is really scary and daunting. It's all about Web3 and trends and this PR-focused stuff. But really meaningful innovation needs to bring clear customer value, it needs to bring clear business value, and it needs to build your brand long term. Right now we can see so much marketing bullshit that's about Web3, and actually most of the time it's just a headline, right? It's not really something that truly moves things forward, right? So innovation needs to happen at core business model level. You just need to go back to your brand truths. If this is the brand, and this is our purpose, then what is our white space? What is the role of all of these things? How do we organize these things that are happening to make sense for our customer experience and our customer story? Because ultimately, your brand, it's the sum of every single interaction. It's not just a static thing that lives in a brand book. It's a storyboard, right? And a homogeneous experience relies on the symbiosis of brand and how you deliver your service. It is very, very, very important. This is an example of some work we did for Chanel, but it's how we think about it is what is the customer thinking? What are the actions the customer take? What are the backstage things that need to happen in your organization? Who are the people responsible for delivering the service? How can you imbue every one of those touch points with personality and spark? So questions to ask yourself, are we writing the right story? Right? What is the story of our brand? What is our client experience? Are we evoking the correct emotion and encouraging the desired behaviors? Right? Are we fundamentally asking the right questions? Great. Thank you very much.